The courthouse archives in Charleston, South Carolina, still hold a document that locals whisper about as the Beaufort Deception, a marriage certificate dated March 15, 1855. On that page, the bride's name appears once as Elela Nina Ravenel, the adopted daughter, and again as Elela Nina Beaufort, the lawful wife of the same man who had raised her for nearly a decade. That official paper tells a story shocking enough on its own. But the truth that followed was darker still, a trail of murder, fraud, and calculated betrayal that reshaped families and fortunes across the Carolina Lowcountry. The Beaufort family didn't just break moral codes, they eliminated anyone who stood in the way of their rise, seizing rice plantations and amassing one of the largest fortunes in the antebellum South. What unfolded in Charleston between 1847 and 1855, inside the Grand Beaufort mansion, was a saga of loyalty turned into control, inheritance twisted into greed, and family bonds weaponized for power. In 1847, Charleston was the glittering crown of Southern society, where moss-draped oaks shaded cobblestone streets and jasmine perfumed the air, though it mixed with the harsher smell of a slave-based economy. South of Broad Street, the elite lived in palatial homes, their wealth drawn from the vast rice and cotton plantations that stretched across the low country like fields of both prosperity and suffering. Among these families, the Beauforts were unmatched. Their name was carved into marble banks, their influence embedded in every corner of Charleston's political and social world. At the center stood Silas Beaufort, 52 years old, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, a man whose quiet voice masked a ruthless mind. He had inherited Magnolia Grove, a massive rice plantation with over 300 enslaved workers, but his greatest fortune came from his web of land acquisitions, slowly tightening control over prime territory from Charleston to Savannah. The family's mansion on East Bay Street rose above the harbor, its balconies catching sea breezes, and its windows surveying the ships that carried Charleston's wealth north. Inside, crystal chandeliers flickered across polished mahogany floors, and portraits of ancestors stared from their gilded frames, silent witnesses to a legacy of power, secrets, and blood. Silas Beaufort shared the East Bay mansion with his wife Margaret, a frail woman whose constant illnesses kept her tucked away upstairs, and their 3 children. Charles, the eldest, at 25, already ran the plantation's daily operations. Victoria, 22, was spoken of in Charleston's parlors as one of the city's most desirable young women. William, the youngest, at 19, was deep in his law studies at the College of Charleston. To society, the Beauforts embodied Southern refinement, their home filled with candlelit dinners, turtle soup, and Madeira wine, as political alliances were cemented over silver service. Yet once the guests were gone, the family's private talks cut sharper than any ballroom gossip. They plotted expansion like generals planning a campaign, treating the Carolina Lowcountry not as heritage but as territory to conquer plantation by plantation. That polished facade began to crack in the fall of 1847, when whispers of sudden deaths among neighboring families rippled through Charleston's social circles. The Ravenel tragedy became the most notorious of all. On the night of November 3, 1847, a fire erupted at their plantation during one of the driest autumns anyone could recall. Witnesses described flames leaping skyward like unholy dancers, and some swore the smoke carried a strange chemical bite, as if fueled by more than timber and cotton. By dawn, the Ravenel home was gone, reduced to scorched chimneys and warped scraps of iron. James Ravenel, his wife Sarah, and their infant son perished in the blaze. Only 10-year-old Elela Nina survived. Searchers found her 3 days later, wandering the ashen gardens, her clothes burned at the edges, a half-melted wooden doll clutched to her chest. Her wide, vacant stare and hushed words unsettled even the most hardened men. She whispered of masked intruders who had come in the night, saying only that she hid where Papa told her to hide. Dr. Hamilton Prescott, who examined her, noted she bore no burns or smoke damage, and seemed to know details about parts of the house she could not have seen if she'd been trapped in her room. His notes hinted at a child who had witnessed far more than anyone realized. Sheriff Thomas Rutledge's official report, however, told a simpler story. A lamp overturned in James Ravenel's study, igniting the blaze. Given the Ravenels' recent financial misfortunes, many accepted the explanation. But unasked questions lingered. Why had the fire spared the slave quarters and barns while devouring the main house? Why had the livestock been moved days earlier? And most troubling, why did the family's safe, known to contain land deeds, inheritance documents, and boundary maps that stretched well beyond their plantation, vanish without a trace? Those missing papers should have secured Elena one of the largest fortunes in South Carolina. But they disappeared in the flames as if erased on purpose. With no deeds or inheritance records to prove her claim, her birthright was gone. Before the ashes even cooled, Silas Beaufort arrived with uncanny speed. He claimed a field hand had run to Magnolia Grove after spotting the fire, yet his timeline never fully matched the testimony of others. Still, Beaufort quickly took control, overseeing burials, arranging shelter for the surviving child, and personally ensuring she received medical care. Charleston society praised him as a man of Christian virtue, stepping in during tragedy. What few knew was that Beaufort had visited James Ravenel just 2 days before the fire for what James described as urgent business that could change the family's future. The years that followed Elena's adoption into the Beaufort household seemed to outsiders like a storybook act of kindness. She grew into a striking young woman, admired for her intelligence and beauty. While Charleston's gossip columns praised the Beauforts for their generosity in raising her as their own. Behind the mansion's polished facade, however, her life was carefully managed. She was given the finest tutors in literature, music, and languages, but always under strict supervision. Her letters were read before they were sent. Her visits monitored her past, erased with warnings that returning to the Ravenel ruins would only shatter her fragile health. Margaret Beaufort's decline became another shadow in the household. Once delicate, her illnesses grew darker and stranger. Fits of confusion, violent stomach pains, memory lapses that left her unable to recognize her children. Dr. Prescott's visits became a fixture, yet his treatments never helped. Servants whispered about poison, though never above a hushed voice. As Elena neared her 18th birthday in the spring of 1855, the household's atmosphere shifted. Charles, once her protective brother figure, now avoided her entirely. Victoria, her closest ally, began speaking in veiled warnings about sacrifice and duty to the family's standing. Even the servants looked at her with a mix of sorrow and unease. The greatest change, though, was Silas himself. The man who once comforted her as a child now regarded her with cold calculation. His tone when speaking to her grew less like that of a guardian and more like a man arranging a business deal. Silas began pressing Elena about her future, with a new urgency, insisting that the family had to keep its assets together and safe from outsiders, and whenever she asked about suitable young men in Charleston, he shut her down and hinted at factors she could not yet grasp. The first clear sign of what he intended came when she overheard him and Charles in the plantation office. Their voices low as they spoke of her, like an account to be balanced, with Charles worried about legal tangles, and Silas focused on making arrangements and removing problems before they began. That night, she lay awake under the canopy, listening to whispers that seemed to travel through the walls, and she started to notice things she had missed, doors that were always locked. Letters that vanished the moment they arrived, conversations that ended the second she stepped into a room. Most unsettling was Margaret Beaufort, whose rare moments of clarity brought fierce grips and broken warnings about trusting no one, about secrets buried deeper than Charleston graveyards, and about a payment that would one day come due for years of easy lies, only for confusion to return and leave her staring at Elela Nina as if at a stranger. The truth finally stepped into the light on a sweltering August afternoon in 1855, when Silas summoned her to his paneled study, where the heavy drapes kept out the harbor air and the family attorney Josiah Peaton waited with a folder of papers, a presence that told her this was not a family chat, but a reckoning. Silas spoke with measured care, as if reading from lines he had practiced, saying new railroad investments had gone wrong, that partnerships had fallen apart, and that the family now faced pressures that demanded immediate and decisive action. And while he talked, she saw his hands shake as he poured the brandy, saw him avoid her eyes, and saw Peaton shuffle documents with the jittery focus of a man afraid to drop what he held. Then the numbers came: debts layered on mortgages, notes due at Charleston banks, obligations to business associates, all stacked from years of what Silas called bold expansion and what sounded to her like a long and dangerous gamble that had finally turned against them. Without swift action, Silas warned everything the Beauforts had built would crumble within months. The rice fields that sustained their wealth would be claimed by creditors, the grand East Bay mansion sold to the highest bidder, and the Beaufort name forever marked by ruin and disgrace. But he assured her there was a way out. He had uncovered an obscure path through old property records and inheritance loopholes, a solution that could save them all if she agreed to play her part. At first, his explanation sounded like a puzzle of legal terms, but as the words settled, Elela Nina felt her stomach twist. The plan hinged on marriage. By wedding, her Silas could transfer any potential claims she had from her parents' estate into his control. And under South Carolina's spousal property laws, those assets would be shielded from the family's mountain of debt. It was not love he spoke of, only strategy. How marriage could serve as a firewall against financial collapse. The family's attorney, Josiah Peaton, laid out papers suggesting her parents had died without proper wills, leaving her legally destitute, despite the vast properties she should have inherited. With practiced authority, he argued that without the Beauforts, she would have been nothing, reminding her of the education, comfort, and position they had provided. The marriage, he said, would only formalize what already existed in practice, her dependence on them. For more than 2 hours, Silas alternated between fatherly warmth and cold calculation, sometimes softening his tone with assurances of her security, other times pressing with legal reasoning that left her head spinning. Peaton rattled off precedents and statutes, each one less clear than the last, each designed to box her into a corner of confusion. By the end, she found herself nodding, agreeing to consider the proposal, though every instinct screamed against it. The mahogany-paneled study seemed to shrink around her, the air heavy with brandy and tobacco. And beneath it all lingered something sharper, the unspoken scent of fear and desperation, clinging to both men, despite the polished confidence in their words. That night, Elela Nina shut herself away in her bedroom, her thoughts tangled in revelations she could barely process. She had always sensed that her adoption carried unspoken motives, but the cold precision of Silas Beaufort's plan revealed a depth of ruthlessness she hadn't dared imagine. As dusk fell over Charleston Harbor, ships drifting past the barrier islands in the fading light, she began to piece together a terrifying possibility. Her parents' deaths and her own miraculous survival may not have been tragic chance at all. They could have been the first move in a calculated scheme that had been unfolding for nearly a decade. In the weeks after that August meeting, her world began to unravel with eerie precision, as though unseen hands were dismantling the foundations of her life, brick by brick. Determined to learn the truth, she decided to investigate her parents' estate herself, applying the discipline she had gained from years of study. Her search led her to the Charleston County Courthouse, where she met Benjamin Hartwell, a seasoned clerk in his 60s who knew the archives like scripture. Hartwell, meticulous and proud of his record-keeping, retrieved documents that immediately contradicted everything she had been told. James and Sarah Ravenel had indeed prepared formal wills in 1846, clearly designating Eleanor as their sole heir. Trustees had been named maps and deeds carefully filed, and the records left no doubt she was meant to inherit not just her family's plantation, but thousands of acres spanning 3 counties. The lands represented some of the most valuable rice-growing territory in the region, much of it bordering Beaufort property. Far from destitute, she was supposed to be one of the wealthiest young women in South Carolina. The shock deepened when Hartwell showed her the condition of the files. Pages were missing. Dates didn't align with the court's own ledgers. Signatures looked altered in ways too subtle for chance. Someone with power, wealth, and legal expertise had been quietly corrupting the official record. And the trail pointed directly to the Beauforts. Hartwell admitted that over the years, he had fielded repeated requests from Beaufort representatives for Ravenel estate records. They had always been framed as routine legal research. But when viewed together, the pattern suggested a long, coordinated campaign to cloud, weaken, and ultimately erase her rightful inheritance. Defying years of prohibition, Alela Nena made her way back to the ruins of her family's plantation, a place spoken of only in hushed tones inside the Beaufort mansion. The land was cloaked now in kudzu and young pines, but beneath the tangle of green, the scars of fire still lingered. As she studied the charred remains, troubling details emerged that shattered the official version of events. The foundation stones revealed burn marks at multiple ignition points, evidence of a deliberate blaze rather than an overturned lamp. Metal fragments glinted among the ashes, the kind of material foreign to an ordinary plantation house. And most damning of all, buried beneath collapsed beams, she uncovered the remains of her father's study safe. It had not been melted in fire, as Sheriff Rutledge's report claimed. It had been pried open with tools, its contents removed before flames ever touched it. Standing in the ruins, memories she had long dismissed as nightmares rushed back in sharp detail. The sound of men arguing in her father's study. The hidden crawl space where he had pressed her to stay silent until morning. The acrid smell of coal oil being poured deliberately across wooden floors. For 8 years she had been told these were the false recollections of a traumatized child. But here in the ashes, they surfaced as undeniable truth. Driven by both rage and clarity, Alela Nena expanded her investigation. What she uncovered was a chilling pattern stretching back over 15 years. Families of wealth and influence across the Low Country meeting sudden tragic ends, their lands and fortunes swallowed soon after by the Beaufort Empire. In 1841, the Middleton family perished in a riverboat accident, their prime rice plantations sold at bargain prices to Silas. In 1844, yellow fever swept through the Drayton household, and their Charleston mansion found its way into Beaufort, hands through tangled mortgage arrangements. In 1846, the Hampton family simply vanished, leaving debts that Silas generously absorbed in exchange for their plantation. Each tragedy looked at first glance like misfortune. But the legal pathways that followed the auctions, the debt settlements, the inheritances redirected, were all written and notarized by the same steady hand, Josiah Peaton. His law practice had flourished precisely as the Low Country's most prominent families fell one by one, leaving their legacies to be folded neatly into Beaufort control. Alela Nena's suspicions and discoveries soon began to echo inside the walls of the Beaufort mansion, reshaping her daily life into something both suffocating and sinister. Margaret's health had worsened to the point that she rarely left her room yet. In her fleeting spells of clarity, she whispered fragments about James and Sarah Ravenel, details so precise that they hinted at a knowledge she should never have possessed. The servants no longer spoke freely around Elena. They avoided her gaze, their silence weighted with pity and fear, as though they knew what was coming, but dared not intervene. More unsettling still, Eleanor realized she was being shadowed whenever she ventured beyond the house. Men lingered at street corners, keeping their distance, but never out of sight. Her letters vanished before reaching their destinations. Conversations were cut short when she entered a room, and every outing was now framed as a threat to family reputation. The comfort of her adopted life had calcified into the bars of a gilded prison. The reckoning came on a rain-soaked September night in 1855. Returning from another visit to the courthouse archives, Elena stepped into the front parlor and froze. The entire Beaufort family was assembled, their faces stiff with grim resolve. The grandfather clock in the hall struck 8, each toll resounding like a gavel, a countdown to judgment. Silas sat behind his mahogany desk, posture rigid, expression unreadable, as if presiding over a trial. Charles stood near the fireplace, his hand resting casually beside a loaded pistol placed on the mantel, its presence as deliberate as the glint in his eyes. Victoria occupied her mother's chair, but the polished veneer of Charleston's belle had cracked dark circles, shadowed her eyes, and her fingers twisted nervously in her lap. Even Margaret had been wheeled into the room, pale and trembling, her wrists mottled with fresh bruises that told Eleanor she had been brought down by force. The parlor itself no longer resembled the space where so many social evenings had played out. Heavy drapes sealed the room from the outside world. Extra lamps cast shadows that pooled in corners, exaggerating every line of stress across the Beaufort faces. The air was thick with unsettling odors, the sharp tang of medicine, the metallic bite of fear, and beneath it all, the faint sweetness of rot that Eleanor had come to associate with her stepmother's illness. She had barely shrugged off her soaked cloak when Silas spoke. His voice held none of the warmth she once clung to as a child. It was the voice of a man conducting business, stripped of affection, each word precise and measured. He knew of her courthouse visits, her search through archives, even her return to the ruins of Ravenel. He called these actions reckless, ungrateful, and dangerous, not only to the family, but to her. And as his eyes bored into hers, Eleanor realized this was no longer a conversation. It was a sentence being passed. Silas laid out the truth with a precision that chilled Elena to the bone. He knew everything, every visit to the courthouse, every page she had studied, every word she had exchanged with Benjamin Hartwell. The kindly clerk who had seemed so helpful was in fact feeding information directly to Charles. Every revelation she thought she had uncovered on her own had been permitted, curated, and closely monitored to make sure she learned just enough to grasp her vulnerability, but never enough to escape their control. Even her secret return to the Ravenel ruins had been shadowed by hired men who reported her every movement. The Beauforts knew she had seen the pried-open safe, the unnatural burn marks, and they knew her memories of that night were beginning to sharpen into terrifying clarity. With his plan exposed sooner than expected, Silas admitted they had been forced to accelerate their final design. For the next hour, he stripped away the lies she had lived under each revelation, delivered with the cold efficiency of a surgeon cutting away diseased flesh. He explained that the Beaufort fortune had not grown from legitimate enterprise, but from a calculated campaign spanning more than 20 years. Plantation after plantation, family after family, every piece of their empire had been won through carefully staged tragedies. Drownings, fevers, fires, disappearances, all disguises for murder, fraud, and manipulation that cleared the path for Beaufort dominance. Her father, James Ravenel, had been the first man willing to pull at the threads, What began as curiosity over oddities in the Middleton estate transfer had led him to uncover a chilling mosaic, the suspicious deaths of neighboring families. The fraudulent mortgages, the sudden property seizures, all linked by the same attorney, the same banknotes, and the same beneficiary. His files contained enough proof to expose the Beaufort dynasty and bring down their empire. Worse still, those documents revealed that Charleston officials had been bought and silenced their signatures on fraudulent transfers purchased with Beaufort wealth. James's holdings were not simply vast acres of rice land. They were the linchpin between Beaufort properties, the missing link that would have created an unbroken corridor of plantations running from Charleston all the way to Georgia. To Silas, those lands weren't just valuable, they were essential. And so he told her, with the calm certainty of a man describing a business strategy, James Ravenel's fate had been sealed long before the night of the fire. What began as routine curiosity turned into a dossier of crimes that would have ended any honest family, for James Ravenel had spent months tracing a pattern of sudden deaths and suspicious transfers across the Low Country. And by the time he finished, he had assembled proof that cut straight to the heart of the Beaufort Empire. He had documented at least 17 families whose losses lined up too neatly to be chance. He had compiled copies of forged deeds and altered filings. He had traced payments from Beaufort accounts to known criminals, and he had even secured coerced confessions and witness statements that named names. Most damning of all was testimony from Margaret Beaufort herself, spoken during one of her rare lucid intervals when the effects of the poison that was slowly killing her had lifted just long enough for her to speak with shocking clarity about meetings where murder was treated like an investment and about the exact places where evidence had been hidden or destroyed. When James came to Silas with that weight of documents and witness lists, claiming he would expose the scheme, Silas accepted no negotiation. He saw only one answer to a threat that could undo decades of calculated acquisition. The fire at the Ravenel house was not an accident. Charles Beaufort and 3 hired men brought in from New Orleans executed the plan with the cold skill of professionals, men who had worked such crimes before. Guided by weeks of surveillance that mapped the family routines, the times servants left, the hours James kept late in his study. The night was chosen for maximal darkness and minimal help. The dry autumn weather chosen to ensure flames would spread and consume records before anyone could save them. The safe in the study pried open and emptied long before any blaze reached it. Everything about Ravenel's work that could have broken the Beauforts was scheduled to vanish, and with the documents gone and the witnesses silenced, the path to their holdings would look like law and luck instead of the chopping block it had been. The assassins had slipped into the Ravenel house through the basement door that Charles himself had unlocked days earlier under the guise of a friendly visit. Moving with the precision of men who had done this work before they made their way to the study, where James and Sarah Ravenel were still awake, drafting the final pieces of evidence they intended to deliver to federal authorities. The murders were quick and clinical, carried out with chloroform-soaked rags that left no marks of violence. Their bodies were then arranged so it would appear they had been overcome while trying to escape a house fire. Only Elena survived because her father had anticipated betrayal. Months before, he had constructed a narrow refuge between the walls of her bedroom, stocked with food and water, and had trained her carefully in how to use it. On that night, he had sent her there with firm instructions: stay hidden until morning, no matter what you hear, and if fire comes, flee to safety. From that secret hollow, she endured the horror, the muffled struggles of her parents, the harsh voices of strange men, the clatter of tools forcing open her father's safe, the rustle of papers being gathered, and the casual talk of killers treating death as routine business. She also watched them spread coal oil and chemical accelerants across the floors. Substances chosen for their ability to burn hotter and faster than wood erasing evidence while leaving fire patterns that would look like an accident. The blaze was timed with ruthless care, set during a dry spell when flames would consume the house fully and collapse the structure inward, burying what little might remain beneath smoldering rubble. By dawn, nothing of the Ravenel household survived, except a traumatized child in hiding. Silas Beaufort's appearance as rescuer and benefactor in the tragedy was not born of compassion, but of necessity. As long as Elelonena lived there, lingered the risk that she might recall what she had seen or reveal the location of evidence her father had hidden elsewhere. Keeping her close meant keeping her under watch. For 8 years, the arrangement worked. Eleanor grew up believing herself indebted to the Beauforts' generosity, while in truth her isolation from her past was carefully enforced to keep her from rediscovering the truth. Tutors, guards, servants, and even her social life all were managed to ensure her memories stayed buried. But the plan had always been moving toward a final step. The proposed marriage was not an impulse born of desperation. It was the culmination of a scheme refined over nearly a decade, designed to bind Eleanor and her inheritance legally and permanently into the Beaufort Empire. Silas spoke with the precision of a man finalizing a contract, leaving no space for misunderstanding. Once Elelonena became his wife, every potential property claim tied to her parents' estate would fall under his control. The law itself would shield him for spousal immunity, meant she could never testify against him in court. And if she resisted, the marriage would still provide legal cover for actions they were already prepared to take. It was then that the family revealed with chilling casualness the truth about Margaret. Her mysterious decline had not been the work of failing health or bad fortune, but of a deliberate, measured campaign of arsenic poisoning that had stretched on for more than 2 years. Doses hidden in her daily medicines had slowly unraveled her body and mind, stripping away her ability to intervene or confide in outsiders. Within months, they said she would be dead, regardless of any medical care, leaving Silas free to remarry and claim her dowry properties, which had been carefully insulated from his debts by prenuptial agreement. The plan was seamless in its cruelty. A widower marrying his adopted daughter might raise whispers, but in Charleston's elite circles, such arrangements were not unheard of. With Beaufort influence pressing on judges, politicians, and newspapers, the union would be sanctified in the eyes of society and the law. The machinery of reputation and respectability would grind down any objection until the marriage appeared as inevitable as the tides in the harbor. As Elelonena listened, horror welled in her chest. She saw with sudden clarity that her entire life since the fire had been nothing more than a gilded trap. Every gesture of kindness had been calculated to bind her. Every privilege had been another chain disguised as a gift. Her education, her social training, even the limited freedoms she had been granted, all were tools to shape her into the perfect pawn, polished enough to hold wealth, yet caged enough never to challenge it. Charles made their ultimatum plain. She knew too much to walk free, but she was too valuable to simply discard. If she agreed to Silas's marriage proposal, she would live comfortably, though always as a prisoner. If she refused, she would share the fate of her parents and every other family who had stood in their way. The same hired men who had watched her steps through Charleston were already stationed to act the very killers who had destroyed her childhood, waiting for a single order to silence her. And even if she managed the impossible escape contact with authorities, a desperate plea to federal officials, the Beauforts' reach would smother it. Records could vanish, witnesses could be intimidated or eliminated. Investigations redirected. Their web of corruption stretched far beyond Charleston, woven through sheriffs, judges, and even federal appointees whose careers depended on Southern wealth. In such a system, truth was a fragile thing, easily smothered under layers of money, power, and fear. The moment Silas thought he had Eleanor cornered, the the balance of power shifted. Margaret, long assumed to be a broken shadow of herself, rose unsteadily from her chair. Her trembling frame seemed ready to collapse, yet her voice carried the strength of a woman who had nothing left to lose. The words that poured from her lips cut through the parlor like thunder, stripping away years of deception in an instant. She had not been the fragile invalid they believed her to be. For years, Margaret had played the role of the fading wife, her confusion and illness providing the perfect camouflage while she worked in secret. She had listened, recorded, copied, and hidden. Behind the mask of frailty, she had built a private archive of damning evidence account books, tracing payments to killers, letters exchanged with crooked officials, maps of seized properties, soil samples tainted with chemical accelerants, and most damning of all, her own careful transcripts of family meetings, where murder was planned like business strategy. The arsenic poisoning, far from breaking her, had become her shield. Its effects explained away her eccentric behavior, giving her freedom to gather proof under her family's very nose. For nearly 15 years, she had constructed a case file so detailed that it documented not only past atrocities, but future crimes still in planning. Names of families under surveillance, dates of meetings, financial arrangements. A blueprint of corruption and blood that could topple the Beaufort dynasty forever if delivered to the right hands. The revelation cracked the room open. Eleanor's heart pounded with the realization that her stepmother had been her silent ally all along. Silas and Charles, however, saw only the death of their empire staring them in the face. Federal prosecution meant the gallows, the rope, the disgrace of their name. Even Victoria, pale and silent in her mother's chair, seemed to realize she was no longer shielded from ruin. Silas's mask slipped first. The charm, the fatherly tone, the measured businessman's voice, all gone. His words turned venomous threats spilling from him as desperation replaced calculation. Charles, meanwhile, reached instinctively toward the fireplace mantel, his fingers brushing the pistol placed there earlier like a final insurance policy. The air thickened with menace, the polished facade of Charleston's genteel family life collapsing to reveal its rotten core. In that rain-soaked parlor, the Beauforts stood exposed, not as Charleston's aristocracy, but as predators facing the moment when their carefully spun web threatened to strangle them instead. Margaret's last sound shattered the Beaufort's grip more completely than any gunshot could. Standing on trembling legs, her voice hollowed by poison, yet sharpened by purpose, she made it clear that her evidence had already outgrown the family's reach. The documents were hidden in places they would never think to search, bound to surface, even if she died that very night. And she had entrusted Elena with instructions and names, federal contacts already circling, waiting only for proof to bring Charleston's most powerful family crashing down. That revelation ignited the parlor like a powder keg. The Beaufort mask of civility disintegrated in an instant, and years of cruelty that had simmered beneath polished manners erupted into violence. Charles lunged for his mother's papers, sparking a struggle so savage it left the room in ruins. Margaret's fragile body could not withstand the combined toll of poison and her son's assault. She collapsed her final breath, carrying both defiance and deliverance, while Elena seized her chance. In the chaos, Eleanor escaped into the storm, clutching the evidence that could dismantle everything the Beauforts had built. Rain lashed the cobblestones, blurring the streets she had known since childhood. But fear turned familiarity into strangeness. Behind her, hired killers mobilized the same men who had murdered her parents, now unleashed to silence the last surviving witness. Every step through Charleston's rain-drowned alleys tested the survival instincts honed during years of captivity, masked as privilege. The records she carried were not merely proof of crimes, they were the anatomy of an empire of blood. Margaret had left behind ledgers of payments to assassins, correspondence with bribed officials, maps of seized properties, and even samples of earth marked by chemical accelerants. More damning still, she had cataloged names and dates, showing not only who had already fallen, but who the Beauforts planned to eliminate next. For federal prosecutors, it was nothing less than a blueprint of the South's most sophisticated criminal syndicate. But reaching those prosecutors proved far harder than Margaret had promised. Eleanor quickly discovered that corruption ran deeper than anyone had admitted. Her first attempt to present the files to the federal marshal's office ended in betrayal. The supposed safe channel was compromised, its officers more loyal to Beaufort influence than to Washington law. Word of her arrival spread before she could finish speaking, and only a desperate flight through back alleys kept her alive. Her salvation came from the most unlikely place, Benjamin Hartwell. The courthouse clerk she once believed to be a Beaufort spy revealed himself as something more complex. For years, Hartwell had feigned cooperation while quietly pursuing his own inquiries into the family's crimes. He had ties to a hidden network of local officials and federal contacts working in secret building cases against Southern conspiracies too powerful to confront directly. Now, with Eleanor in his care, the strands of that covert effort converged. Hartwell's true role emerged only after Eleanor's escape. His reports on her courthouse visits, which she had once feared were meant to betray her, had in fact been designed to protect her, nudging her investigation in the right direction, while shielding her from the most immediate dangers of the Beaufort machine. With her testimony and Margaret's hidden records in federal hands, the story of one family's crimes swelled into something far larger. The federal inquiry that followed stunned even seasoned prosecutors. What had seemed a single dynasty's ruthless ambition proved instead to be the heart of a sprawling criminal network. Judges, sheriffs, and politicians across the Low Country had been bought and bent while hired killers erased entire bloodlines to clear paths for fraudulent land transfers. The Beauforts were not isolated predators. They were part of a regional syndicate that stretched into Louisiana, Mississippi, and Georgia, a southern empire of blood and paper, designed to consolidate plantations through murder, disguised as misfortune. Margaret's meticulous records paired with Eleanor's testimony cracked open decades of silence. More than 40 accomplices and collaborators were indicted, their names a who's who of Charleston respectability. Attorneys, bankers, magistrates, even church elders. Federal marshals and prosecutors re-examined hundreds of suspicious deaths and disputed inheritances, discovering patterns that reshaped the history of Low Country aristocracy. Families once thought victims of fever riverboat accidents or unfortunate fires were revealed instead as casualties of a calculated campaign. The arrests that began in early 1856 sent shockwaves through Charleston society. Well-dressed men were pulled from carriages, plantation mistresses watched their husbands marched in irons, and courtrooms filled with names, once whispered with respect, now shouted as criminals. For the first time in memory, the city's legal establishment itself became the target of prosecution. Its record scoured for decades of corruption that had enabled the Beauforts to thrive. Silas Beaufort's downfall came as he tried to flee Charleston Harbor aboard a vessel bound for Cuba, carrying foreign bank drafts and false papers. Federal marshals boarded before he could escape, uncovering not only hidden accounts, but fresh plans to replicate the conspiracy in new states. His capture destroyed any hope of preserving the dynasty. Charles's arrest was bloodier. He met the marshals at the family mansion with gunfire, leaving 2 officers wounded and several hired men dead. Shot and partially paralyzed, Charles survived only to face trial as living proof of the family's violence. Victoria's surrender was quiet, but her testimony was not. Behind the mask of the dutiful daughter, she revealed knowledge as detailed and damning as her father's. Bank ledgers, political arrangements, names of paid-off officials, all laid bare in her careful words. Far from a sheltered innocent, she proved herself a calculating partner in the enterprise, her polished social grace concealing a mind deeply embedded in the mechanics of conspiracy. Victoria's willingness to betray her father and brother to save herself turned the tide of the entire prosecution. Her testimony, offered in exchange for reduced charges, provided prosecutors with an insider's map of the conspiracy, the names, the methods, the hidden accounts that no outsider could have pieced together alone. By the summer of 1856, Charleston had become the stage for one of the most sensational trials in American history. The federal courthouse filled daily with lawyers, politicians, journalists, and curious onlookers, all drawn by the spectacle. The case exposed not just the Beaufort family's decades of murder and fraud, but the systemic rot that had sheltered them: judges who ignored evidence, sheriffs who silenced witnesses, politicians who traded justice for bribes. What unfolded in those proceedings revealed vulnerabilities in the very foundation of Southern society, shaking public faith in the institutions meant to protect them. At the heart of it all stood Elela Nena. Her testimony provided the thread that tied the evidence together. Calm, articulate, and unflinching, she described the night of the fire, the years of manipulation, and the discovery of her stepmother's hidden archive. The defense tried to cast her as a fragile victim, hysterical and unreliable. But the young woman who faced the court bore no resemblance to that caricature. Instead, she embodied resilience, intelligence, and the quiet determination that had carried her through nearly a decade of captivity. The prosecutors laid out a portrait of crime on an industrial scale. At least 37 families systematically eliminated their plantations and fortunes, folded into the Beaufort Empire. The financial value of the stolen lands and assets exceeded $2 million, an astronomical sum at the time, making it one of the largest accumulations of criminal wealth in American history. Silas Beaufort was found guilty of murder, fraud, and conspiracy and sentenced to hang. His execution in March 1857 drew thousands, a grim carnival of public vengeance. On the gallows, he offered no apology, only bitter words about federal meddling in what he still insisted were legitimate business practices. Charles received the same sentence, though his lawyers dragged the appeals out for years. When the rope finally tightened around his neck in 1859, it closed the last direct chapter of Beaufort power. Victoria's conviction was less final. She received 20 years, serving 12 before being released in poor health whispers, suggesting that she too had been a victim of the poisons that had haunted her family's women. The wider net of prosecutions swept up more than 20 public officials, along with dozens of businessmen whose fortunes collapsed under asset seizures and civil penalties. Charleston society, once the polished stage for the Beauforts' rise, was left scarred by scandal and forever marked by the trials that revealed how wealth and violence had been intertwined for decades. The Beaufort trials did more than dismantle a dynasty. They reshaped the very framework of American law. By prosecuting a network that crossed county and state lines, federal authorities set precedents that affirmed Washington's willingness to step in when the local institutions collapsed under the weight of corruption. For Charleston, the spectacle was both humiliation and reckoning, a reminder that even the most polished facades could conceal rot. For Elela Nena, the aftermath was bittersweet. The courts restored her inheritance, making her one of the wealthiest women in the South. Yet her wealth was less important than the justice it represented. Properties taken from families, erased by Beaufort violence, were returned to her stewardship when no heirs survived. Through her long-silenced victims received recognition, and their names were reclaimed from the shadows of fraudulent ledgers. Managing this empire required new mechanisms, trusts, and institutions designed to safeguard land from corruption. These innovations became models for agricultural management across the South, creating a legacy of accountability where conspiracy had once thrived. But Eleanor's personal journey diverged from Charleston's public obsession with the scandal. She left the city quietly after the trials, unwilling to live under the constant gaze of neighbors who saw in her both survivor and symbol. Though absent in body, She remained present in spirit, channeling her fortune into schools, charities, and homes for orphans and young women, those most vulnerable to the kinds of exploitation she herself had endured. In these institutions, her trauma was reshaped into protection for others, her fear transmuted into opportunity. Yet even as she built this new future, her private writings reveal a woman who never fully escaped the shadows of her past. Nightmares haunted her, trust came reluctantly, and she lived with an ever-present sense of fragility. Resilience carried her forward, but scars remained etched not only in memory, but in the way she viewed the world. The Beaufort properties themselves became symbols of both crime and closure. Auction sales stretched on for more than a decade as courts untangled webs of fraud and restored lands to rightful heirs. The East Bay mansion, once the glittering seat of Charleston's most feared family, stood empty, its grandeur poisoned by memory. Eventually it was torn down, replaced with a quiet park. Today a modest plaque there names the victims, without spectacle, an understated memorial in a city once defined by spectacle. Local residents say the old site still carries an air of sorrow, as if the ground itself remembers the crimes committed there more than a century and a half ago. But the Beaufort case wasn't just Charleston's dark secret. It revealed how deeply corruption had seeped into the very foundations of Southern society. The scandal forced reforms in property law, inheritance rights, and judicial oversight, setting new precedents that rippled across the country. It became one of the earliest examples of the federal government stepping in when local institutions failed, paving the way for Reconstruction-era prosecutions and even later civil rights enforcement. For Eleanor Ravenel, the outcome was bittersweet. She became one of the wealthiest women in the South, but her true victory was justice, not only for her parents, but for the dozens of families silenced by the Beauforts. The inheritance restored to her included compensation for estates stolen from families with no heirs to claim them. And her fortune was not left idle. Eleanor funded schools, orphanages, and charities to protect the vulnerable, especially children and young women left exposed by circumstance, the same way she had once been. Yet her private letters remind us that no verdict could erase her pain. She lived with nightmares, mistrust, and a lingering sense of fragility that no amount of wealth could heal. Justice was served in law, but not in memory. The East Bay mansion was eventually torn down, its cursed walls, replaced with a park where a small plaque honors the victims. The Charleston courthouse still holds the infamous marriage certificate, a document never signed, a reminder of how close the conspiracy came to succeeding. Today historians study it not only as a record of fraud, but as proof that even the most sophisticated schemes can unravel when confronted by courage and truth. Eleanor's story is a warning and an inspiration. Corruption can spread like ivy through every institution, but it cannot outlast those willing to fight it. So what do you think? Was justice truly done, or were the Beaufort crimes too vast to ever be fully answered in court? Let us know in the comments. And if you found this story as chilling as we did, subscribe, share it with a friend, and join us next time as we uncover another shadowed chapter of America's hidden past.